My cousin Jake is a Coast Guard vet who's been on duty for more than 10 years. He's not the type to spin stories or make up nonsense. He's straightforward, super grounded, and not the superstitious type. Not into horror movies or ghost stories at all. He's just a practical guy who's crazy about boats and keeping things in order. He shared this story with me back in the summer of 2022. I had to ask him to recount it a couple of times because each time I couldn't believe how wild it sounded. But every time he told it, every detail stayed crystal clear. It all happened back in 2017 when he was assigned to a lighthouse off the coast of Maine on a biannual maintenance rotation. The place was called Seagull Point, and it was way out there, only reachable by boat or helicopter. Just a jagged, rocky island with one lighthouse and a small auxiliary building that held fuel and maintenance gear. No electricity grid, no plumbing, and pretty much no cell service. The lighthouse was fully automated, but it still needed occasional manual upkeep, which was why the Coast Guard would send people out there now and then. Usually, it was a solo gig, but there had been some strange electrical issues the previous year. So this time, they decided to send two guys, Jake and another guy named Mike. The first few days were uneventful, windy, dull, and repetitive. During daylight hours, they'd check the beacon systems, test the emergency batteries, refill the diesel generator, and scrub away layers of salt corrosion on the metal surfaces. At night, they'd read, eat simple meals, and play cards to pass the time. It was lonely out there, but that was part of the job, nothing suspicious about it. Then came the fourth night, and Jake woke up around 2 a.m., feeling weird, not sick, not in pain, just like the atmosphere around him suddenly changed. He described it as feeling like standing in the middle of a room just before a thunderstorm, but outside was clear and silent. He sat up and looked around, and everything was pitch black. That's when he noticed something odd. The beacon wasn't rotating. The lighthouse was supposed to send out a sweeping beam every few seconds, even when under maintenance. If that went down, it was a big deal. Without warning, he shook Mike awake, and both of them climbed the narrow spiral staircase to peer out at the top of the tower to see what was wrong. When they arrived, the gears that usually rotated the lighthouse were moving fine, but the actual light wasn't turning. There was something jammed in the mechanism, a large dark cloth, kinda like a blanket or an old coat, wedged deep into the gear assembly. It was soaked, covered in slimy, mossy stuff, and smelled like dead seaweed mixed with mildew. Both guys looked at each other in confusion. The door to the lighthouse had been locked, and the windows sealed tight. No wind, no birds, no explanation for how anything could get inside. They carefully pulled out the cloth, tossed it outside into the wind, and shook their heads, thinking maybe it was just some weird little incident. But of course, Night 4 saw the same thing happen again. The light stopped rotating, and sure enough, there was another piece of cloth, only this time smaller, kind of like an old scarf or a shawl, frayed and soaked in seawater. It even had tiny barnacles on it, as if it had been underwater. That was the moment Jake felt things weren't just coincidence anymore. It wasn't random debris getting into a sealed lighthouse. They checked the doors, windows, even the supply closet. Everything was secure. Their minds were starting to think that maybe someone was messing with them, or worse, that something had gotten inside the lighthouse, deliberately messing with the light. Starting that night, they blocked the stairwell with heavy crates, making sure everything was double-locked. But on the seventh night, Jake says something happened that he can't quite explain even now. He was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when he distinctly heard Mike whispering from across the room. But he wasn't talking to Jake. Instead, he was murmuring strangely toward the corner of the room, saying weird, disconnected things, like someone was standing there in the shadows. Jake leaned over to ask what he was saying, but Mike blinked slowly, looked confused, and said he wasn't saying anything at all. Later that night, Jake woke up again, and this time he found Mike sitting at the window, staring down at the rocks below. When he asked what he was doing, Mike said he thought he saw someone out there, barely visible in the edge of the lighthouse beam. He said it looked like someone was watching them, and then it disappeared when the light rotated away. That's when things kept escalating. Mike just kept acting stranger every day. He stopped sleeping, hardly talked anymore, and just sat staring out the window for hours. Jake asked if he was okay, but Mike would just mutter about weird noises in the wall or hearing voices inside the stairwell. On the ninth night, they both heard footsteps, not the usual wind creaking, but slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the lighthouse above. Jake looked over and saw Mike standing at the bottom of the stairs, dead still, staring upward. When he asked if Mike had gone upstairs, he just shook his head. Neither of them moved for a moment, just stood there listening. Then the footsteps stopped, and everything was dead silent. That night, they pushed a dresser in front of the bedroom door and slept with knives under their pillows. On the 11th night, the lighthouse's light went out again, and when they got to the top, the door to the beacon room was wide open, not just unlocked or slightly ajar, but swung fully open, as if someone had kicked it in. The wind howled through the space. Inside, the beacon wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tampered with it deliberately. The bulb was unscrewed and placed upright on the floor, a hefty, industrial-grade bulb that's hard to twist off by hand. Jake stared at it, frozen with terror, while Mike kept murmuring that someone had done this. Then he felt something cold brush against his back, not a breeze, but actual physical contact. He spun around, but nobody was there. Mike turned ghostly pale and started pointing at the wall, whispering he saw a hand reach out from the bricks. Terrified, they bolted back down the stairs and locked themselves in the bedroom, neither sleeping the rest of the night. Jake said Mike just kept rocking back and forth in the corner, whispering to someone unseen. Come morning, Jake used the emergency satellite phone to call for a rescue, claiming there was a serious mechanical malfunction. The Coast Guard ship arrived in the afternoon, but here's the weird thing: when the crew asked about his distress call at 2:12 a.m., Jake realized he'd never made any call. The crew played a garbled, static-filled recording that included a voice whispering about being there with someone. Then it just cut out. Mike didn't say a word during the entire trip back. A few months later, he quit the Coast Guard and never told anyone what really happened out there. Jake still does some maintenance work now and then, but he swears he'll never go back to Seagull Point. It was during the COVID lockdowns, a time when everyone was going crazy being stuck inside. I was single then too, and I'd spend my nights swiping on Tinder, chatting with random people, or just watching movies. Honestly, what else was there? I started talking to a girl I'd been following on Instagram for years. Her name was Lisa, or Lissy she called herself. We live about 20 minutes apart in Suffolk County, Long Island, just a quick drive from the Hamptons and like an hour from Montauk. One night, bored out of my mind, we decided to hang out. She lived close by, so I picked her up, and we drove out to this abandoned park nearby. We brought some White Claws and just chilled there. Right away, I got the vibe Lissy was kinda rebellious, but in a cool way, into hopping fences, sneaking onto private property, stuff like that. We clicked fast, and in less than an hour, she suggested we drive out to Montauk and walk along the cliffwalk around the lighthouse, even though it was technically closed past sunset. I wasn't worried. I like adventures like that, and she was confident there'd be no security. She said she'd done this sort of thing before, even before all the lockdown stuff. So we finished our drinks and headed out east to Montauk Point. Once there, she told me to just park in the lighthouse parking lot. I hesitated a little, but she seemed pretty sure no one would bother us on a random Tuesday night during the off-season. There were no other cars in sight, so I went with her word. She claimed she'd done this before, back when she was a kid. We parked, cracked open another White Claw, and I kept nervously scanning around, wondering if some security trucks were watching us. She told me to just relax. Then we started walking over to the lighthouse itself. Seeing a lighthouse up close like that, especially at night, it's kind of awe-inspiring, but also kind of eerie. You can't really explain it, but there's something about the whole place that feels off. So we veered toward the back. a little away from the main entrance to avoid catching any attention. That was my first time ever at Montauk Lighthouse. Lissy led us toward the cliffside behind it, where a rocky trail called the Cliffwalk winds along the edge. Our only light was our flashlights because the place was pretty much dark, a few faint lights at the entrance, and of course, the lighthouse beam itself. As we moved along carefully, Lissy behind me suddenly called my name. I turned around, and she was shining her light behind her, illuminating someone else on the rocks. It was a figure, dark, hooded, and I couldn't tell much about him except he looked like a black guy. No idea how old he was. I called out, asking if he was security or something. He didn't answer and he didn't move. I told him, "We're leaving now, sorry." I was nervous, maybe some security patrol, and I didn't want to get in trouble. But then the guy said something that made my stomach drop. He asked, "Y'all wanna buy some coke?" At first I thought he was joking or maybe a security guard messing with us, but no, this was just some random dude. That made it worse. Why the hell was he even here? I told him, "No, man, we're good," and motioned for Lissy to keep walking. We kept moving and he started walking behind us, not saying a word, just matching our pace. It was so weird and uncomfortable. We'd glance back every now and then and he'd be the same distance away, never getting closer but never dropping behind either. It was like he was stalking us, and honestly, it freaked us out. When we reached the end of the cliff path, we practically ran to the car. That guy was still behind us, matching our speed, calling out something we couldn't hear but it sounded like, "Where are you going?" I wanted to avoid trouble, not want to fight or get into a confrontation, so I told Lissy not to respond. We got to the car, and just as we pulled in, two more guys appeared out of nowhere from behind us. I didn't want to run, that make it worse, but one of them shouted something at us too. I couldn't hear what, but it was enough to send us into full panic mode. We barge into the car, and Lissy and I both scream when we realize all three of them are right on top of us. The first two were trying to open the doors, like, literally, kicking, and I slammed the gear into reverse and hit the accelerator as fast as I could, trying to get out of there. I reversed blindly, just aiming away from them. They kicked at the car, hit the doors, but they didn't chase us once we sped off. My heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding through me, and we just sat there in silence for a while, too rattled to say anything. When I finally dropped her off, we were like two shells of ourselves, still shaken. We hung out a lot after that, but I never went back to Montauk at night again. That night still haunts me. Another story I'll tell you, it's from my old friend Marcus, who's a rough-and-tumble guy. He's in his mid-50s, tough as nails, with face lines from decades of working with salt water and wind. Marcus has done marine salvage, and he's been all over the coast fixing boats, ships, you name it. When he told me this story, I believed it instantly because he's the real deal, the kind of guy who's seen stuff most people never will. He told me this happened back in 2013 when he was hired to inspect a lighthouse off the coast of Washington. It was a small, abandoned lighthouse on a tiny, lonely island. The place hadn't been used or maintained for years. Just a stub of rock rising out of the water with the lighthouse, a little generator shed, and a bunch of rusty scaffolding. No docks, just a tiny ledge where a Coast Guard boat could drop him off at high tide. Marcus packed light, some food, a sleeping bag, tools, his radio. The plan was simple. He'd go there Monday, do his inspection by Wednesday, and get picked up Thursday. He said he'd done the same routine countless times before. When he arrived, the weather was gloomy, cold, and foggy, the typical state of that place. The lighthouse was about 50 feet tall, built in the early 1900s, with a spiral staircase inside leading to the beacon. The glass lens had been broken long ago, but the structure was still rock solid. Marcus did his usual safety check: supports, stairs, windows. The lower floor was warped but safe to walk. The second was just storage, full of rusted metal cabinets. Up at the top was a tiny, unused sleeping corner. He took his bedding to the ground floor by the generator because it was warmer there. That first night passed peacefully, too peacefully, actually. When you're used to the usual haunts and noises of the world, the silence at an abandoned lighthouse can feel oppressive. On day 2, though, the fog rolled in heavy, and Marcus woke up to a blanket of white fog outside his window, so thick he couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead. It looked like a floating wall of clouds. No wind, no birds, just this eerie silence. By the second day, the fog was so thick it seemed almost solid. Marcus spent the day taking notes, climbing the stairwell. That's when he saw something strange halfway up the stairs, built into the wall, was a small maintenance closet with corroded hinges. On his first day, he couldn't open it, but now it was slightly ajar, just an inch, enough to see inside. The moisture in the air must have shifted it, but he didn't like it. So he pried it open the rest of the way, revealing a pitch-black interior. Inside, in the back corner, was a small wooden box, maybe the size of a lunchbox, covered in damp moss, as if it had been underwater recently. He didn't open it, just shut the door again and made a mental note to report it when he got back. That night, he says, he was awakened by an unsettling silence, like everything had just stopped. Then he heard footsteps on the metal stairs, not the usual wind or animal sounds, but deliberate, heavy footsteps ascending. Marcus turned on his flashlight and stared up at the staircase, listening. But whatever was up there didn't come down. The steps kept going upward, slow and steady. Eventually, silence settled again. The next day, Marcus searched everywhere, every room, every closet, even went up to the roof. Nothing out of the ordinary except the moss-covered box, which was now outside the closet, partially into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He took it, heavy and swollen from moisture, but the lid was nailed shut, so he left it alone. Outside, he saw footprints, bare footprints, no shoes, just wet, human impressions in the mud, leading from the north side of the lighthouse out toward the cliff edge, vanishing into the sea. He watched them for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone came ashore, but the boat schedule didn't match, and the fog was so thick, they probably couldn't have navigated back. He considered calling for an early pickup, but the fog had usurped visibility. Instead, he locked every door and hatch and braced himself for the night. But that night, things got even weirder. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door of the top beacon room slam shut so hard that dust fell from the ceiling. Then, slow, deliberate knocking, not on the door, but on the inside wall of the tower, like someone standing just behind the plaster, knocking on the brick. Marcus lay frozen, unsure whether to run or stay quiet. When dawn broke, he checked everything again. The box was gone, the closet door wide open. It was obvious he was no longer alone there. He called for rescue on the radio immediately. The Coast Guard showed up, heavy fog hanging all around. Marcus told them he had a medical emergency and needed to be evacuated. They promised to send a boat in a few hours. He packed his gear, waited at the landing, but the fog refused to lift. It grew thicker. He sat for nearly 7 hours, only able to see a few feet in front of him. When the boat finally arrived after dark, he saw shadows moving behind him in the fog, but when he turned around, nothing was there, or he just couldn't see them. They took him off the island, and as they neared the coast, Marcus looked haunted. He told me that the lighthouse was dangerous, that it should be sealed off. He filed a report, but he never mentioned the footsteps or the mossy box. He said he didn't want anyone to think he was losing his mind, that maybe some of it was just the isolation messing with him. He never went back there. He wrapped up his projects and slipped quietly out of field work altogether within a year. Said he just wanted to stay on dry land from then on. When I asked if it was because of that lighthouse, he shrugged, just said he'd seen enough out there. And then he looked me dead in the eye and said something that's stuck with me ever since. Some places are meant to stay alone. They just need silence and time. That's all he'd say. I've tried digging into that lighthouse myself some years later, but I couldn't find much. The coordinates he scribbled in his notes don't match any known lighthouse. The records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but no official name, no history. It's like he was never really there in the first place. And that's what bugs me the most, not Ian's story, but what no one else ever talks about. Honestly, I don't know whether I hope Ian was just going crazy from loneliness or if there was really something out there. Maybe some spots just shouldn't be disturbed. Maybe they don't want to be.